cunning plans, PR, and a very tall woman. Join me for an episode on tyrants in ancient Greece on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi and welcome, my name's Neil. In an episode on my mini-series on ancient Sicily, I had an episode called Tyrants and Tragedy where, you guessed it, I spoke a lot about tyrants. At the time, I said I'd do an episode specifically on the tyrants of ancient Greece, and so here we are. In this episode, I'll be going back to the Archaic and early Classical period, so from the 7th to the mid-5th century BC, and asking some basic questions. What were tyrants exactly? How did they seize power? And what did they do? I'll also play devil's advocate and ask whether they were really all that bad. Before I begin the standard fare, please review or rate this podcast or episode on the platform you're using. You can even leave comments on individual episodes on Spotify now. It's fab to have them. So, well, you get the hint. Oh, and by the way, this podcast is also now on YouTube as a podcast, and my YouTube channel is Ancient Blogger. And that brings me to where else you can find me. You can find me on X, TikTok, Instagram, and as I said, YouTube as Ancient Blogger. This podcast is also on X as @HoundAncient, and I have a subreddit which is gaining followers called Ancient History Hound. Finally, there's my website, ancientblogger.com. One final thing, a main source for this was Tyranny and Political Culture in Ancient Greece by James F McGlew. I bought this book well over a decade or so ago, and it has certainly earned its keep in the course of researching this episode. Okay then, let's begin. To start with, we need to head back to the 7th century BC, as it's here that we find possibly the earliest use of the word tyrant. It was used in poems by Archaic, a famous poet, where he assailed Gyges, a king of Lydia, as a tyrant. Archaic didn't stop there. He also used it as a metaphor. A lover might rule his heart in a similar way to a tyrant ruling a city. The Archaic period saw the apparent rise of tyrants, the definition of which isn't easy to pin down. Perhaps a good basic definition is a person who rose to power, or often seized it, through non-standard conventions. What do I mean by that? Well, in short, a tyrant bypassed the normal political structure of that city and its processes, and then bolstered their position through military force or putting their friends in powerful positions. They shored themselves up. Often, as Aristotle noted, a tyrant might emerge from an oligarchy. This was a political system which saw a narrow group of elites, often leading families, hold the positions of political power and influence. It's easy to see how an individual from one of these families or groups decided that some of the power wasn't enough, they wanted all of it. We often get a sense that tyrants emerged from an intense level of competition between the groups or families. This could also manifest as stasis or political instability. Once in power, a tyrant could be very gracious to his friends and devastating to his enemies. The former might be given the choicest positions within the city. Rival noble families might find their property confiscated, them exiled, or even worse. As a tyrant ruled supreme, he wasn't accountable to anyone and would often use his friends who he'd elevated to provide him support and loyalty. The fact that a tyrant had unchecked power meant they could do more or less anything they wanted. And as you can imagine, this might mean a lot of bad stuff, usually to the rival nobles, less so to the poor. But as you'll hear at the end of the episode, they could also do things which greatly benefited their city. Going back to Archaic, he wasn't the only early poet firing broadsides at tyrants. A poet named Alcius had this to say, and I quote, "Now we must get drunk and drink with all our might, since Myrsilos is dead." End quote. The fragment of this drinking song named Myrsilos, who was a tyrant back at Lesbos, and presumably the reason Alcaeus was exiled. Dig a bit deeper, and Alcaeus' invective against Myrsilos might have more to it. Alcaeus was born a noble on Lesbos. It might have been that he was involved in the political game I sort of implied earlier, and a loser of it. This brings into play the question about perspective, because we invariably hear about how bad tyrants were. But to whom exactly? A logical position to take on this is that a tyrant was more concerned by his political rivals and those he had trodden on to get to his position. It was more likely that the threat to him came not from the poor, who likely had it bad whatever the political structure was, but rather from the other nobles, those rival families. And this is important to consider. Not that tyrants were all fluffy and nice and just the victim of bad PR and slander, but that sources might be aligned more to the position of those who had directly lost out. In the classical period, sources might also add to this through the lens of politics, which I'll come to later. Try though he might, the tyrant was rarely safe and must have been looking over his shoulder and checking under the bed constantly. Perhaps this was a driver of their extreme actions. A tyrant couldn't rely on the respect of their position to provide them with any cover. Both the tyrant and the office they assumed were inextricably tied. Get rid of the person, and the tyranny would fall. By definition, then, the tyrant was bound to this dynamic. They had painted themselves into a corner, and it was rare that a tyrant could ever not be a tyrant, though as you'll hear, sometimes they try to redefine themselves or seek some legitimacy to their position. Solon summed it up neatly when he observed that being a tyrant was a good place to be, but a hard place to get out of. There's also the issue of succession, by the way, and I'll be mentioning that shortly. So, how did you become a tyrant exactly? Well, the chances are you're a noble within a small group of other nobles, or simply someone with the resources to accrue support you needed. This wasn't necessarily political support though, and our first tyrant is a great example of this. On the southern shore of Sicily is Agrigento. Though back when it was founded around 580 BC, it was known as Akragas. Around 10 years after its foundation, the people of Akragas decided to build a temple to Zeus, an entirely reasonable thing to do. They turned to Phalaris, who had been a tax collector, and so had the knowledge of finance which would underpin the whole project. Phalaris got straight to it and ordered in large amounts of building materials. This he stored on site in the city at the citadel where the temple was being built. Phalaris also used the money to recruit workers. These were slaves and outsiders who were presumably looking for work. Again, nothing unusual. But things didn't go well. The building site had been raided and some supplies stolen. Phalaris requested that this area now be fortified to secure it. This he had done. His grab for power was made during the Thesmophoria, a festival. Whilst it was being celebrated, his workforce put down their tools and picked up weapons. With a defensive position within the city and a personal army, he attacked the people and became tyrant. Much of our account of this comes from Polyaenus, who wrote in the 2nd century AD. It's probable that he was using earlier sources, as Phalaris is mentioned in association with something I'll come to in a moment. The account of Phalaris' rise to power carries what may have been tropes by the time of Polyaenus, but could also be true. Festivals were a time when a city was vulnerable to an attack. The infamous Catiline conspiracy at Rome was intended to take place during the Saturnalia. Hannibal was able to take Taras when the residents were in celebration of a festival there. What's also of note here is the account of Phalaris' men attacking the people. What was more likely than a random assault was that specific individuals were targeted, most likely members of the rival families or nobles, and these would certainly have been present at this festival. Before we leave Phalaris, I'll come to that famous, or rather infamous association, the Brazen Bull. This was an empty bronze bull in which people were placed and roasted alive, their screams coming out of the bull's mouth. It's debated as to whether this existed and was merely a tale about how awful tyrants could be, though in antiquity it seems to have been widely accepted. The tyrant's use of deception became fertile ground for the sort of stories which have the whiff of "really?" about them. A great example of this was Pisistratus. In the 6th century BC at Athens, he was a tyrant on 3 occasions. The first instance contained perhaps the best example of this duplicity. To set the scene, tensions between the leading families at Athens were running high at the time, with 2 main rivals, Pisistratus and Megacles. After a particularly bitter argument with Megacles, Pisistratus returned the next day to the Athenian agora. He was bruised and wounded, even his mule had been beaten. Displaying his injuries to the onlookers, he blamed his political rivals and requested that he was given a bodyguard of 300 men for protection. This he received, and after arming them with clubs, he used them as his personal army to seize power. Again, we might think that rivals were persuaded to back him, rather than anyone being attacked. But also what's interesting here is the bodyguards being armed with clubs, not spears. McGlew made a nice observation about the club. It was seen as more of a pacifying weapon. It wasn't like a spear, which really has only one outcome. It was often associated with justice. The club as a weapon was also linked to Heracles, who went around civilizing the dangerous non-Greek parts of the world and bringing order and justice to them. Perhaps then his men armed with clubs might have reassured that he was bringing stability to the people rather than startling them. After exile, Pisistratus was invited back to Athens by Megacles, funnily enough. Pisistratus would marry his daughter, and so there would be no more rivalry. He returned, but not without performing what Herodotus commented seemed to him was the silliest trick history has to record. This involved a very tall woman called Phi. She was dressed in full armour and put on a chariot. Heralds was sent to Athens proclaiming that Pisistratus was being honoured by Athena and she was bringing him home to Athens. Herodotus commented that rumour of this spread and that some people believed that this person, Phi, was genuinely Athena and had actually welcomed Pisistratus back. Perhaps they did, perhaps not. Perhaps it was just a very good bit of political PR. Not all tyrants achieved power through a ruse. Sometimes it was by taking advantage of a political situation. Gelon, the tyrant of Gela and then Syracuse, was the cavalry commander of the previous tyrant Hippocrates. Upon Hippocrates' death, he acted in support of the sons of Hippocrates, but then ditched them and took power for himself. It seems that though Hippocrates had been popular, his continual campaigning had made for fatigue amongst his supporters. What Gelon presumably offered was an element of political consistency, but with him in charge and perhaps a welcome change. It's also notable that as cavalry commander, he may have had support from the nobles who formed this part of the army. Perhaps those disgruntled with Hippocrates realised Gelon was seeing things from their perspective, and were therefore happy for him to keep the position of tyrant as long as he supported things they were interested in. The opportunism shown by Gelon highlights that the death of a tyrant didn't necessarily mean a continuation of it in terms of bloodline. As I mentioned earlier, the position of tyrant died with the tyrant. The irony was that tyrants could only ever be so by subverting the existing political norms of that city. However, such norms were exactly what a tyrant needed for his sons to inherit the role. Many tyrants were one-hit rulers, their sons or relatives not taking up the mantle. But sometimes there was a short dynasty, and I'll pick up on 3 instances of these reigns shared across members of a family. The first concerns Cypselus, who became tyrant of Corinth in the 7th century BC. Rather than a trick or ruse, it seems Cypselus was destined to be a tyrant, which was heard of via an oracle. This didn't go well with the Bacchiadae, a leading family at Corinth, and one which had much to lose. They sent assassins to kill the infant Cypselus. However, one smile from the infant stalled their blades. When they returned, presumably after stealing themselves, he'd been hidden away in a chest by his mother and couldn't be found. And apparently that chest was dedicated to Hera at Olympia, or that's at least what Pausanias wrote. Cypselus fulfilled the oracle and expelled the Bacchiadae, which, according to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, had unintended consequences. A member of this family was a man called Demaratus, who had settled in Tarquini, an Etruscan city north of Rome. He had 2 sons, one of which was named Lucumo, who married an Etruscan noblewoman and then left for Rome to make his fortune. This he certainly did. Upon arrival in Rome, he changed his name to Lucius Tarquinius Priscus and eventually succeeded as Rome's 5th king. As a caveat though, just remember that much of Rome's regal period has the prefix mythical or legendary because it is largely myth. And yes, I did a mini-series on the Roman kings, which you can listen to and obviously includes this story. The Cypselid dynasty continued with Periander, who you'll hear of later. After Periander died, his nephew Psammetichus continued as tyrant, but only lasted for 3 years. We head back to mainland Athens for our second dynasty, the Pisistratids. After Pisistratus died in 527 BC, power passed to his son Hippias. Initially, things went well until Hipparchus, the brother of Hippias, was killed or rather assassinated. And after this point, Hippias turned into a highly paranoid and vengeful tyrant. The killers of Hipparchus were Harmodius and Aristogeiton. These 2 were famously known as the Tyrannicides, and in Athens they were heralded as helping to found democracy. The death of a tyrant was the spark which lit the fire of democracy, freeing the Athenians, or rather, that's how the account was crafted. I'll come to why in a moment, but let's revisit what most likely happened. I covered this event on my episode on how democracy took root at Athens, just in case you want to check it out, and obviously I go into more detail there. But in short, the assassination of Hipparchus had very little, if anything, to do with the establishment of democracy at Athens. To start with, the Tyrannicides killed Hipparchus, not actually the tyrant. They also did so not out of a sense of bringing freedom to the Athenian people, it was a personal feud. Both Harmodius and Aristogeiton, who by the way died as a result of the attack, were nobles, and the motivation was personal, not political. Finally, let's consider some dates. Hipparchus was assassinated in 514 BC at the Panathenaic Games, and the reforms of Cleisthenes, where democracy is said to have initiated, didn't occur until 508 BC. That's a fair few years. Out of interest, the tyrant Hippias was removed by that famously democracy-loving bunch, the Spartans. That's sarcasm there just in case, but it was the Spartans who removed the tyrant. Why then the different version? Well, it's argued that the early democracy was keen to find a suitably noble foundation event. What better than one involving a tyrant killed by champions of the people for a noble cause, and even better if it removed the Spartans from, well, actually doing the removal of the tyrant. By the way, the Spartans weren't doing this out of love for the new ideas of democracy. They were doing it for separate political reasons, and you can find out more about that in that episode that I mentioned. Though this version of events doesn't survive scrutiny, it was popular. But then a good story is, or was, or always will be a good story, and it's stuck. The topic of democracy brings me to a point I made earlier about how tyrants were perceived. It's easy to see how fellow nobles might have hated them. In the case of political systems, we can also see how opposite a tyrant was to democracy. A tyrant was a sole figure, with no accountability and didn't need to take any consultation. In the 5th century BC, Athens took the art of tragedy to further comment on this. Sole rulers acting similarly to tyrants have these negative qualities made clear on the big stage. Take Creon, for example, in the play Antigone. He's a rightful ruler, but displays the qualities of a tyrant. He makes his own laws without consulting the people or even nobles. Athens also introduced a measure to mitigate a tyrant from emerging, the famous process of ostracism. Again, and I generally feel a bit awkward now, I did an episode on this. A vote for ostracism was taken each year, and if approved, then another vote was taken a few months later to decide who that might be. The caveat was that even if one was taken, there was a minimal number of votes required to be cast to make the ostracism legitimate. So even if they did vote to have one, you still needed to hit a certain number before it could be made legitimate and that person exiled. Ostracism, though undoubtedly famous to this day, wasn't actually that common. The exact number of those ostracized is debated, but it sits at between 9 and 15 people. Eventually, the process was abandoned. This was because by the end of the 5th century BC, the democracy was embedded enough within the culture and the people that tyrants weren't a threat anymore. Instead, the democracy had to deal with demagogues. The third and our final dynasty was the Dinominid. This occurred on Sicily in the early 5th century BC. This wasn't named after the initial tyrant, but it took its name from Dinomenes, and this was probably because he was the father of 3 brothers who were each tyrants. First up was Gelon, who I mentioned earlier. He had taken over from an existing tyrant called Hippocrates in 491 BC. Gelon inherited a very nice situation. Hippocrates and in fact Gelon both hailed from Gela, a city on the south coast of Sicily, and under Hippocrates this had come to dominate the other Greek cities in the eastern third of the island, and even some native Sicilian communities. Sicily provided a tyrant with something unusual, land to expand, rather than being restricted, as it were, by a city-state's existing borders. Hippocrates had added other Greek colonies to his portfolio. One location, though, was still holding out, Syracuse, and Gelon managed to capture it during a civil crisis there by siding with the Syracusan nobility. Gelon's time as a tyrant ended in 478 BC, but not before he looked to legitimize him being a tyrant. After a famous battle, the Battle of Himera, he presented himself to the people in Syracuse and offered to step down or make himself accountable to any of them. The people, perhaps wild with delight over his success, would not hear of it and acclaimed him their leader. Obviously, this was all pre-planned, but it seems to have been engineered to move Gelon from a tyrant to something more legitimate. This type of situation can even be found in the accounts of the Roman kings, albeit with a caveat that these were most likely crafted centuries later and at best were mixtures of myths and oral history. The 6th king, Servius Tullius, managed to sidestep the normal process of being voted in as king, as was the custom. When criticised for this, he called an assembly of the people and offered to step down. Cue the same response from the people who wanted him to stay. And this acted in place of him being elected, or at least seems to have been. Another possible route for legitimacy for a tyrant was through founding a city. The founders of cities were held in high esteem in ancient Greece and often afforded the very highest of honours. Gelon's brother, Hieron, who succeeded him, decided that this would be his strategy. He founded Etna, and I do the air quotes thing here because there was already a city where Etna was to be founded. What Hieron did was move most of the people out of the city of Catana, tinker with its borders, and then bring in a number of his supporters and settlers from the Peloponnese. Voila, a brand new city, sort of. And in case you wondered, no, this did not last. After the death of his brother, Thrasybulus, who took over and lasted less than a year, Etna took its old name of Catana back, and the people who moved back there found the tomb of Hieron and destroyed it. The case of Hieron also highlights that sometimes tyrants weren't bothered by the lower classes and the poor. It serves to highlight that tyrants often shared similar aspects to their stories and how they did their business, but they could also be quite different. The Dinominid are also a good example of patronage. Hieron was a big fan of poetry, having Bacchylides at court and employing Pindar to extol his virtues as a wise leader and a ruler in his odes. Note, not as a tyrant. Both Gelon and Hieron sent teams and athletes to the games, the wider Greek Pan-Hellenic Games, with Hieron victorious in the Olympic chariot race. At Delphi and Olympia, they set up dedications and treasuries. Both these locations were popular and perfect places for a bit of denominated PR. I'm going to finish with that question I posed at the outset about tyrants not being all bad. Again, bad to whom exactly? A poor farmer might have been very grateful to Pisistratus. He famously paid off their debts, and under his rule, Athens grew in reputation. The city bustled with visitors. The Panathenaic festival was reinvigorated under his leadership. Outside of the city, in the countryside, the region of Attica, he vastly improved the agricultural production, and the economy improved under him. It's even argued that the famous owl on the coins of Athens became a thing under him or his son Hippias. But Pisistratus wasn't the only tyrant to do this. Polycrates made Samos a naval powerhouse and a trading hub. Even, and I say this quietly, even Phalaris was credited with growing Acrogas into a prosperous city. And on that point, there was Periander. He was the tyrant of Corinth who reigned between 627 BC and 585 BC, the son of Cypselus, who I mentioned earlier. He was widely respected in ancient Greece, even being heralded as one of the 7 sages. Corinth also flourished under his rule, and this even included the construction of the Diolkos. This was an overland track across the narrow strip of land connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. It was a sort of Panamanian canal of its day, because it allowed merchants to make a 7-kilometre overland journey with their ships hauled along a track versus a much, much longer trip sailing round the coast of the southern Peloponnese. Perhaps the nobles did miss out, but plenty of others benefited under some tyrants. Of course, under a tyrant, you were at their whim, and there was also that whole thing about political instability. What happened, for example, when that tyrant was no more? And even though it wasn't that different for the poor, with the onset of democracy, even a benevolent tyrant might have seemed far less preferable. Because after all, if you were poor in a democracy, you could at least do something. You had some form of a political voice and some form of legal representation. And that brings me to the end of this episode. I really hope you've enjoyed it, and get in touch to let me know what you think, or just get in touch generally. Of course, please rate and review. But more importantly, and I always say this, keep safe and stay well.